In Coldwater Correctional, a black inmate was about to challenge a long-standing regime of abuse and silence. What started as the humiliating daily ritual, forced pledges meant to degrade his intellect, spiraled when Sergeant Ray Kincaid, a legacy white guard, dragged him into solitary for daring to mention a buried truth. Malik Ramsey wasn't your typical inmate. He was once a respected school principal, wrongfully imprisoned on dubious drug charges. For 5 long years, he had endured systemic cruelty with unwavering composure, known for his stoic resistance, commanding intellect, and the silent power that unsettled every guard in D Block. When Kincaid threw him into segregation over a veiled reference to a decades-old cover-up, he had no idea he was messing with a man who had just uncovered damning evidence of a state-sanctioned murder. Malik transcribed the sealed deposition, by hand, hid it in pieces across the prison, and began a quiet campaign of strategic resistance that would set off a chain reaction of whispers, documentation leaks, and inmate unity. What began as one man's abuse of power would become an institutional reckoning. The Coldwater prison system would never forget the day Sergeant Kincaid's ghosts rose from the archives, and his legacy of fear turned into a rallying cry for justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The air in Coldwater Correctional hung thick with Mississippi heat and the acrid scent of industrial bleach. 5:30 a.m., and already the cinder block walls seemed to sweat. This was the hour of reckoning, morning count, when power reasserted itself in the relentless rhythm of prison life. Sergeant Ray Kincaid walked D Block with measured steps, his boots striking a deliberate cadence against concrete. 20 years on the job had taught him that noise was currency. The jangle of his keys, the crisp snap of his baton against his palm. These were the notes of his authority, composed by his father before him and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Kincaids had walked these floors, or floors, like them. 3 generations had understood what it took to keep order. Up and at 'em, ladies. His voice echoed through the cell block. Count time. You know the drill. Inmates shuffled to their cell doors, each man positioning himself according to protocol, standing, dressed, visible. Most avoided eye contact. They'd learned. Ray paused at cell 42, a smile spreading across his face like oil on water. Well, now, if it isn't our educated man. He tapped his baton against the bars. Mornin', Mr. Principal. Malik Ramsey stood, at perfect regulation stance, back straight, hands at his sides, eyes forward. He was approaching 50, with close-cropped gray hair and a frame that had once been powerful but had thinned during his 5 years inside. What hadn't diminished was the quiet dignity in his bearing. Good morning, Sergeant Kincaid. Malik replied, his voice measured and clear. Ray's smile tightened. That voice. Educated, controlled. No trace of fear, no hint of subservience. Just those 4 neutral words that somehow felt like defiance. Step out, Teach, Ray ordered, using the Arbore nickname that had become both an honorific among inmates and a mockery among guards. Time for your pledge. Around them, the cell block went still. New inmates looked confused, but the veterans knew what was coming. This was the ritual, Ray's daily reminder of who held power and who didn't. Malik stepped forward as the cell door slid open. He stood in the center of the walkway, hands behind his back, stance wide, the position of submission that was required of all inmates during special address. Ray circled him once, baton tapping a slow rhythm against his own thigh. He stopped directly in front of Malik, close enough that the brim of his hat nearly touched the inmate's forehead. You know, boys, Ray announced to the block. Mr. Ramsey, here used to be a principal. Thought he was somebody important before he came to Coldwater. Thought being educated made him special. He leaned in closer to Malik. Why don't you share your morning literacy pledge with the class, teacher, so these young men know the value of education? Malik inhaled slowly through his nostrils, his eyes focused on a point just above Ray's head. I pledge that my education, Malik began, his voice even and resonant, carrying down the cell block, does not make me better than any man, I pledge that my words belong to the state of Mississippi. I pledge that my thoughts are subject to correction. From 3 cells down, a young inmate named Deshaun Carter watched, his knuckles white against the bars of his cell. At 23, he'd been inside for 4 years but had never grown accustomed to this particular cruelty. Louder, Ray commanded, so the back row can hear the lesson. Malik's eyes never wavered. I pledge that my education does not make me better than any man. I pledge that my words belong to the state of Mississippi. I pledge that my thoughts are subject to correction. Ray nodded, satisfied, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration. Malik had performed as commanded, but somehow the humiliation hadn't landed. There was something in the way Malik recited the words, as if he were simply describing the weather, neither embracing nor rejecting their meaning. "Thank you for that stirring reminder, Mr. Principal," Ray said, his voice sharp with sarcasm. "Now, would you like to tell the class what happens to educated men who forget their place at Coldwater?" Malik's gaze finally lowered to meet Ray's. For just a moment, something dangerous flashed in the depths of those eyes. A silent acknowledgement that they both knew what this was really about. "They receive correction, Sergeant." Ray's smile returned, cold and satisfied. "That's right. Continuous, rigorous correction." He turned to address the block. "Remember that, boys. No matter what you think you know, what you think you're worth, in here, you're exactly what we say you are." His eyes swept the row of cells, landing briefly on Deshaun. Nothing more. "Man's a fucking joke," Deshaun muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Ray's head snapped toward the sound. "You got something to share with the class, Carter?" Deshaun straightened, his young face carefully blanking. "No, Sergeant." "Didn't think so." Ray turned back to Malik. "Back in your cell, teacher. One day, you'll learn the lesson for real." Malik stepped back into his cell without comment. The door slid shut with a metallic finality. As Ray continued down the block, finishing the count, Malik stood motionless at his cell door. To anyone watching, he appeared calm, possibly resigned. But inside, beneath the carefully maintained composure, his mind worked with precision, cataloging every detail of the encounter, filing it away alongside 5 years of similar moments. "You're playing a dangerous game, Malik." Reverend Isaiah Miles spoke softly as they sat in the corner of the yard later that morning. At 65, the chaplain was one of the few free men who moved between Coldwater's worlds, trusted by the administration, yet respected by the inmates. Malik watched a group of younger inmates shooting hoops on the cracked concrete court. "I'm not playing any game, Reverend. Your silence is louder than any shout, and Kincaid knows it." The chaplain fingered the worn Bible in his lap. "He's looking for a reason. Every day he pushes, hoping you'll give him something he can use." "Should I bow my head lower? Call him sir with more enthusiasm?" Malik asked, his eyes still on the basketball game. "You should survive," Miles replied simply. "Strength without strategy invites ruin, son. I've buried 4 men who thought their dignity was worth dying for." Malik finally turned to the older man. "And how many have you buried who died inch by inch, giving pieces of themselves away until there was nothing left?" The chaplain didn't answer immediately. They both knew the number was higher. "There's a difference between bending and breaking," Miles finally said. "You can give them what they want on the outside while keeping your soul intact." Across the yard, Ray Kincaid stood watching them, sunglasses reflecting the harsh Mississippi sun. He spoke briefly to another guard, nodding in Malik's direction. "Things are changing around here, Reverend," Malik said. "Have you heard about the new education initiative?" Miles nodded. "Warden's pet project, trying to impress the state board before budget season. They'll need someone to help organize the materials, someone who understands filing systems." The chaplain studied Malik's face. "You're thinking they'll pick you. I was a principal for 15 years, taught for 10 before that. Access is a double-edged sword, Malik." A whistle blew, signaling the end of yard time. As inmates began filing toward the doors, Deshaun Carter broke away from his group and approached Malik. "Mr. Ramsey," he said, keeping his voice low. That shit this morning wasn't right. Malik stood, brushing dust from his uniform. It's just noise, D. It's more than noise, and you know it. Deshawn glanced around to make sure no guards were within earshot. The way you handle it, though, man, it's something. Don't mistake composure for acceptance, Malik said quietly. Now head back before you draw attention. As Deshawn rejoined the line, Malik caught Ray watching the interaction, his mouth set in a thin line of disapproval. Warden Carl Strickland adjusted his tie in the reflection of his office window. Below, in the administrative courtyard, a small group of suited visitors waited with cameras and notepads. "This education initiative is going to put Coldwater on the map, Travis," he said to Lieutenant Harlan, who stood stiffly by the door. "Rehabilitation through literacy. The board is eating it up." "Yes, sir," Harlan replied, his face impassive. "The press packet has been distributed." Strickland turned, studying his subordinate. "You don't sound convinced." "I'm concerned about giving certain inmates additional privileges. It undermines the discipline we've established." Strickland waved this away. "It's all about optics, Travis. We show them a few model prisoners reading books, get our funding increased, and life goes on." He straightened his suit jacket. "Who did you select for the library detail?" "Barnes suggested Ramsey," Harlan said, his tone neutral. "Given his background in education." Strickland's eyebrows rose. "Kincaid won't like that." Officer Barnes made a compelling case. Ramsey has a clean disciplinary record, despite provocations. Provocations? Strickland's voice hardened slightly. "Is there something I should know about?" Harlan's face remained carefully blank. "Nothing that requires your attention, Warden. Just the usual tension between certain officers and inmates." "Well, keep it contained. I need everything running smoothly while these reporters are here." Strickland moved toward the door. "If Barnes thinks Ramsey is the right choice, so be it. Just make sure he understands this is a privilege that can be revoked at any time." "Yes, sir." As they walked toward the courtyard, Harlan added, "Shall I inform Sergeant Kincaid of the assignment?" Strickland flashed his practiced public smile as they approached the waiting journalists. "Let's wait until after the press tour. No need to complicate things." Officer Lydia Barnes stood at the end of the corridor, clipboard in hand, watching. The inmates returned from the yard, 3 months into the job, and already the initial idealism that had brought her to Coldwater was wearing thin. When Malik passed by, she nodded slightly. "Ramsey, a moment." He stepped out of line and stood before her, hands clasped behind his back as required. "You've been assigned to the library organization detail," she said officially, loud enough for the record. Then more quietly, "Starting tomorrow, Education Wing, 8 to 11. A flicker of surprise crossed Malik's face before his expression settled back into its usual calm. "Thank you, Officer Barnes." She glanced down at her clipboard. "You'll be sorting and cataloging archived materials. Given your background, the administration feels you're qualified." Down the corridor, Ray Kincaid emerged from a side door, his eyes narrowing at the sight of them. "That's all, Ramsey," Barnes said quickly. "Back to your cell." As Malik walked away, Kincaid approached, suspicious. "What was that about?" Barnes squared her shoulders. "Warden approved him for the education program, library detail." "The hell he did," Ray snarled. "Ramsey doesn't get special privileges, not in my block." "Take it up with Harlan," Barnes replied, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the anxiety fluttering in her chest. "The paperwork's already processed." Ray studied her face, then glanced down the corridor where Malik had disappeared. "You know what he's in for, right? Drug distribution near a school. Man was selling poison to kids." Barnes had read the file. She'd also seen the inconsistencies in the arrest report, the questionable evidence log. But now wasn't the time. "I'm just following orders, Sergeant." Ray's lip curled slightly. "Aren't we all, Officer Barnes?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Just remember which team you're on. Coldwater has a way of teaching that lesson to people who forget." As he walked away, Barnes exhaled slowly. Through the narrow window at the end of the hall, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut, the sound echoing through Coldwater's endless corridors like a promise or a warning. Inside his cell, Malik sat on the edge of his bunk, eyes closed, mentally preparing for tomorrow. The library. Access to records. A small crack in the wall that had contained him for 5 years. Whether it would lead to light or deeper darkness remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, the possibility of choice, of agency, flickered before him like a distant flame. The library at Coldwater Correctional was a contradiction, a space dedicated to knowledge inside an institution designed to restrict it. Morning light filtered through narrow, wire-meshed windows, casting gridded shadows across shelves of outdated textbooks and dog-eared paperbacks. The room smelled of dust and forgotten possibilities. Malik stood just inside the doorway, taking it in. After 5 years of concrete and steel, the sight of so many books in one place felt almost overwhelming. "It's not exactly the Library of Congress," Officer Barnes said, watching his reaction. "But it's something." Malik nodded, still surveying the room. "Where would you like me to start?" Barnes gestured toward a back corner where cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly. "Those are the new materials for the education program. They need to be sorted, cataloged, and shelved." She hesitated, then added, "There's also a basement storage room, administrative records, old case files. Those need organizing too." "Case files?" Malik asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. "Mostly legal documents from when Coldwater was converted to a private facility in the late 90s. Barnes glanced toward the door, checking that they were still alone. "Warden wants everything digitized eventually, but for now, just sort by year and subject." She crossed to a door at the back of the library and unlocked it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. "You'll have 3 hours each morning. I'll be upstairs most of the time, but I'll check periodically." Malik studied her face, trying to read between the lines. "I appreciate the opportunity." Barnes met his eyes briefly, something unspoken passing between them. "Just don't make me regret recommending you." After she returned upstairs, Malik descended into the basement. The space was low-ceilinged and dimly lit, its concrete walls lined with metal shelving units filled with bankers' boxes and accordion files. Unlike the main library, which at least maintained the pretense of order, this room was a testament to institutional neglect. Years of paperwork shoved aside and forgotten. Malik started methodically, working through a shelf of files labeled Administrative Transfers 1995-2000. He sorted, stacked, and organized, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, planning. For the first time in years, he was alone, unsupervised, with access to the inner workings of Coldwater. 3 hours passed, quickly. When Barnes called down that it was time to return to his cell, Malik had made noticeable progress on the first section, but had found nothing of particular interest. For 3 days, Malik worked steadily through the basement archives, establishing a pattern of efficiency that seemed to satisfy Barnes. He was careful to maintain the appearance of a model inmate, grateful for the privilege. Arriving on time, working diligently, asking appropriate questions about the filing system. On the 4th day, as he was organizing a section of incident, reports from 2001, he found it, a sealed manila envelope labeled Inmate Jackson, M, Case Diro 1472, restricted. The word restricted was faded but circled in red. Malik glanced toward the staircase, listening for any sign of Barnes. Hearing nothing, he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a typed deposition, dated August 17, 2001. Malik's eyes moved rapidly across the page, absorbing key details. Deponent states that on the night of August 3rd, officers Ray Kincaid and James Mercer removed inmate Marcus Jackson from his cell in D Block, following an alleged contraband violation. Deponent witnessed Jackson being escorted to shower area D4, though no standard decontamination protocol had been initiated. Malik's heart beat faster as he continued reading. Approximately 45 minutes later, medical was called to D4. Deponent observed Jackson's body being removed on a stretcher, face showing severe contusions inconsistent with the reported slip and fall. Kincaid instructed Deponent to amend the log entries to show Jackson had been alone in D4 for personal hygiene, rather than an officer-escorted visit. The deposition was signed by C. Rodriguez, former corrections officer, and stamped, "Testimony sealed. Matter closed by administrative review." Attached to the deposition was a thin sheaf of additional documents, an autopsy report concluding suicide by hanging, despite noting unexplained injuries predating death, and a memo from then-Assistant Warden Strickland recommending the case be closed without further investigation. Malik heard footsteps above and quickly returned the documents to their envelope. He slid it back into place just as Barnes's voice called down. "How's it going down there?" "Making progress," Malik answered, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within. "Working through the 2001 incident reports now." Barnes descended a few steps, visible from the waist up. "Find anything interesting?" Their eyes met, and for a moment Malik wondered if she knew, if this was why she'd suggested him for this assignment in the first place. "Just standard reports," he said evenly. "Contraband seizures, minor altercations." Barnes nodded, her expression unreadable. "Lunch count in 15 minutes. Wrap it up." When she'd gone, Malik pulled the envelope back out. He needed a copy, but there was no photocopier in the basement. Looking around desperately, he spotted an old typewriter on a desk in the corner. Moving quickly, he took several sheets of carbon paper from a nearby drawer, placed them between blank sheets, and set them in the typewriter. With practiced efficiency, remnants of his days preparing school reports, he transcribed the key portions of the deposition, the carbon creating duplicate copies. Just before Barnes returned, he tucked the copied pages into the lining of his prison-issued boot, carefully sealing the envelope and returning it to its exact position. That afternoon in the yard, Malik sat alone on his usual bench, feeling the weight of the papers hidden in his cell. He'd carefully refolded them and slipped them inside a hollowed-out section of his mattress before lunch count. Now his mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. Marcus Jackson, a name that might have remained forgotten, buried in the basement along with Coldwater's other secrets. A black inmate who supposedly hanged himself after showing signs of being beaten. And Ray Kincaid, present on the night it happened, involved in covering it up. Across the yard, Kincaid stood watching just as he did every day. But today something felt different. When their eyes met, Malik didn't look away as quickly as usual. He held the gaze for a fraction of a second longer, and in that moment he felt a subtle shift in the balance of power between them. Kincaid noticed it too. He pushed off from the wall he'd been leaning against and sauntered over, baton tapping against his thigh. "You're looking pleased with yourself today, teacher," he said, stopping a few feet from Malik's bench. "Library, duty agreeing with you?" "Just grateful for the opportunity to be useful, Sergeant," Malik replied, the familiar words of submission now feeling like camouflage rather than capitulation. Kincaid studied him, eyes narrowed. "Funny thing about opportunities, they can disappear just as quick as they come." He leaned slightly closer. "One mistake, one step out of line, and you're back to being just another number." "I understand how things work here," Malik said. Something in his tone made Kincaid pause. The guard straightened, seeming to reassess the man before him. "Do you now?" Kincaid's voice had lost its casual edge. "I'm not sure you do, Ramsey, but Coldwater's good at teaching lessons to slow learners." As Kincaid walked away, Deshawn approached cautiously, taking a seat on the bench. "Man's been watching. You like a hawk," he said quietly. "Something happened in the library?" Malik kept his eyes forward, voice low. "Knowledge is happening." Deshawn looked confused. "What's that mean?" "It means be patient and be ready." Malik turned to face the younger man directly. "Things are going to change." Officer Barnes sat in her car in the Coldwater parking lot, long after her shift had ended. Rain pattered against the windshield, blurring the prison's floodlights into hazy halos. She'd known the basement archives held secrets. That's why she'd suggested Malik for the job in the first place. His background made him the perfect candidate. someone who might recognize the significance of what was hidden there. But now that he'd been down there for nearly a week, she was beginning to question her own motives. Was she trying to expose Coldwater's darkness or just ease her conscience by proxy? Her phone buzzed with a text from Lieutenant Harlan. Progress report on Ramsey Library detail due tomorrow. Recommend continuation? Barnes stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Recommending Malik's continuation meant giving him more time with those files, time to find whatever might be buried there, but it also meant putting him at risk. Kincaid was already suspicious. She'd seen him watching Malik with growing intensity. After a long moment, she typed, recommend continuation. Inmate showing exemplary organizational skills, ahead of schedule on archive sorting. She hit send before she could change her mind, then started her car. Lieutenant Travis Harlan placed his phone on Warden Strickland's desk. Barnes recommends continuing Ramsey on the library detail. Strickland barely looked up from the budget reports he was reviewing. Fine, as long as he's being productive. Kincaid has concerns, Harlan added carefully. This caught Strickland's attention. What kind of concerns? He feels Ramsey is being given special treatment, says it undermines discipline in D Block. Strickland leaned back in his chair, studying his subordinate. Ray's been with us a long time. His family's been part of Coldwater since before either of us was born. He tapped his pen thoughtfully against the desk. But this education initiative is important. The board's watching us closely. There's something else, Harlan said, his voice dropping slightly. Ramsey's been working in the basement archives. A flicker of unease crossed Strickland's face. What section? Early 2000s administrative files. Incident reports. Strickland was silent for a moment, then set his pen down deliberately. Maybe Ray has a point. Ramsey's got an education, knows how to read between lines. Might be best to reassign him to the main library. Textbooks only. I could make the change tomorrow, Harlan offered. Strickland considered this, then shook his head. No, that might draw attention. Let him finish the week, then find a reason to move him. Something that won't raise eyebrows. Yes, sir. After Harlan left, Strickland opened his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of bourbon and a glass. He poured 2 fingers, swirling the amber liquid as he gazed out his office window at the rain-slicked prison yard below. The Jackson case had been buried for a decade, one of many necessary compromises made to maintain order in a place like Coldwater. He'd been assistant warden then, ambitious and pragmatic. The decision to seal that deposition had been his first, real test of loyalty to the system. He drained his glass in one swallow, feeling the familiar burn. Whatever Ramsey might or might not find down there, Strickland had learned long ago that in Coldwater, the truth was just another commodity to be managed. That night, as lights out descended on D Block, Malik lay on his bunk, one hand resting on the mattress where the copied pages were hidden. In the dim glow of the emergency lights, he could make out the silhouettes of the bars that had contained him for 5 years. But something had changed. The walls still stood, the doors remained locked, yet he felt a freedom he hadn't known since his arrest. The freedom that comes with holding a piece of truth in a place built on lies. Tomorrow he would return to the basement archives one last time. He'd create an extra copy of the deposition, find a more secure hiding place. Then he would wait, watch, plan. The document was leverage, a key that might unlock more than just the truth about Marcus Jackson. Knowledge was indeed power, but in Coldwater, power was dangerous. As he drifted toward sleep, Malik thought about the pledge Kincaid forced him to recite each morning. I pledge that my words belong to the state of Mississippi. I pledge that my thoughts are subject to correction. The ritual of humiliation had been designed to break him, to remind him daily of his powerlessness. But now, with Jackson's story hidden in his mattress, those same words took on a different meaning, a promise not of submission, but of justice, long delayed. In the darkness of his cell, Malik smiled for the first time in years. The chapel at Coldwater was little more than a repurposed storage room with folding chairs and a podium, but it was one of the few places where conversations weren't constantly monitored. Malik sat in the back row as Reverend Miles finished his Sunday service, waiting while other inmates filed out. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The smell of musty hymnals and the Reverend's sandalwood incense hung in the air, a stark contrast to the antiseptic sterility of the rest of the facility. When the last inmate had gone, Malik approached the makeshift altar where Miles was gathering his materials. "Good sermon today, Reverend," Malik said, helping to fold the portable lectern. "Glad someone was listening," Miles replied with a knowing smile. Most of these men just come for the hour away from their cells. They worked in companionable silence for a moment before Malik spoke again, his voice deliberately casual. "I've been organizing old files in the library, learning a lot about Coldwater's history." Miles's hands paused almost imperceptibly before continuing their work. "History's a tricky business. Depends on who's telling it. I came across a name the other day, Marcus Jackson." Malik watched the chaplain's face carefully. "Died in 2001. Suicide, according to the official record." The older man's eyes flickered up to meet Malik's, then darted toward the door to ensure they were still alone. "I remember Marcus. Smart young man. Used to help me sort donations for the chapel." Miles began straightening hymnals with methodical precision. "Wasn't the type you'd expect to take his own life. The record mentioned officers escorting him to the shower area the night he died. One was named Kincaid." Miles set down the book he was holding and turned to face Malik fully. "Son, there are graves all through these walls. Some marked, most not." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Whatever you think you've found, ask yourself if digging it up is worth becoming another unmarked plot." "So you knew," Malik said, not a question but a confirmation. "I know this. Marcus Jackson was beaten before he died. I saw his body before they cleaned it up for the official photos." The Reverend's eyes had grown distant, seeing something from years ago. "I know the report said he hanged himself with his own sheet, but there were marks on him that no sheet could make. And nothing was done." Miles gave a bitter laugh. "Something was done, all right. The officer who first reported inconsistencies in the log, Rodriguez, was fired the next month. The medical technician who questioned the autopsy was transferred, and the system rolled on." Malik absorbed this, connecting it to the deposition he'd found. There were witnesses. There are always witnesses, Malik, but in places like Coldwater, seeing isn't the same as speaking. Miles placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Whatever you're planning, be careful. Kincaid isn't just one man. He's part of a tradition. His father walked these halls before him and his father before that. And they've been burying their sins just as long," Malik said quietly. The Reverend studied him for a long moment. "You know what makes Coldwater different from most prisons? It's not the corruption or the cruelty. Those exist everywhere, it's the memory. This place remembers, holds grudges, keeps score." He squeezed Malik's shoulder once before letting go. "Just make sure you're playing a game you can survive." That evening, as D-Block prepared for the night count, Malik sat on his bunk reviewing his mental chessboard. The conversation with Miles had confirmed what the deposition suggested. Marcus Jackson's death wasn't suicide but something far darker, with Kincaid at its center. The question now was how to use this knowledge, and when. The heavy clang of the block door announced the start of count. Malik rose and took his position at the cell entrance as Officer Barnes walked the tier, clipboard in hand, followed by Kincaid. Their routine was well established. Barnes would mark the count while Kincaid provided intimidation. As they approached his cell, Malik noticed the slight swagger in Kincaid's walk, the anticipatory gleam in his eye. Tonight was clearly earmarked for another lesson. "Officer Barnes, Sergeant Kincaid," Malik acknowledged as they reached his cell. Barnes nodded professionally, making her notation. But Kincaid lingered, baton tapping against the bars. "How's the library treating you, teacher?" he asked, his voice carrying down the block. "Finding anything educational in all those old files?" The question confirmed Malik's suspicion that Kincaid knew exactly what section he'd been working. And this wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a probe, perhaps even a warning. "Just organizing, Sergeant," Malik replied evenly. "Seems like some things haven't been touched in years, since 2001 in some cases." He delivered the date neutrally, but the effect was immediate. Kincaid's rhythmic tapping stopped mid-motion. A flicker of something, confusion, alarm, crossed his face before his expression hardened. "Well, ain't that interesting?" Kincaid said, recovering. "Maybe tomorrow you can recite for the block what you learned, a history lesson to go with your literacy pledge." Malik met his eyes steadily. "I'd be happy to share what I've found, Sergeant. History doesn't stay buried forever." The atmosphere in the cell block seemed to crystallize into something dangerous. Barnes glanced between them, sensing the shift but not understanding its source. Kincaid's face flushed dark red. "Step out of the cell, Ramsey," he ordered, his voice suddenly tight. Barnes looked startled. "Sergeant, I've already marked—" "I said step out," Kincaid repeated, keys already in hand. The cell door slid open with a harsh scrape of metal. Malik stepped into the corridor, hands clasped behind his back in the regulation position. Around them, other inmates watched silently, the block holding its collective breath. Kincaid moved close, speaking just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "You want to explain what you meant by that comment?" "Just an observation about historical record-keeping, Sergeant," Malik replied calmly. "Bullshit." Kincaid's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "You're making veiled threats to an officer. That's insubordination." "No threat was made," Malik said, still maintaining his composure. "Just acknowledging that the past has a way of resurfacing, like Marcus Jackson's case, for instance." The name hung in the air between them. Kincaid's face went from red to ashen in an instant. For a fleeting moment, raw fear flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by fury. "That's it," he snarled, grabbing Malik's arm and spinning him to face the wall. "Hands against the wall, feet back." Barnes stepped forward. "Sergeant, this isn't—" "Stand down, officer," Kincaid snapped, already cuffing Malik's wrists behind his back. Ramsey here just earned himself a week in segregation for threatening an officer and disrupting count. "I made no threat," Malik said, loud enough for the block to hear. "The record should reflect that." Kincaid leaned in, his mouth close to Malik's ear. "The record reflects what I say it does," he whispered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Just like it did for Jackson." As Kincaid led him away, Malik caught Deshawn's eye from 3 cells down. The younger man's face was a mixture of confusion and concern. Malik gave him the slightest of nods, a signal that this was not a defeat but a calculated move. The segregation unit, the hole in prison parlance, was housed in Coldwater's oldest section. 8 by 10 concrete, cells with solid steel doors designed to isolate and disorient. No windows, minimal human contact. 23 hours a day inside with 1 hour for recreation in a slightly larger cage. Malik sat cross-legged on the thin mattress, eyes closed, measuring time by the deliveries of bland meal trays and the changing of guards. 3 days had passed since his confrontation with Kincaid. Contrary to its intended purpose, solitary hadn't disoriented Malik. It had clarified things. Kincaid's reaction to Marcus Jackson's name had confirmed everything. The fear in his eyes, the instinctive anger, these were the responses of a man confronting a buried sin. More importantly, Kincaid had made a mistake. By sending Malik to segregation for what was, by any objective measure, a minor exchange, he'd revealed his vulnerability. Overreaction betrayed weakness, and weakness could be leveraged. The slot in the cell door slid open, breaking his contemplation. Officer Barnes's face appeared in the narrow opening. "Ramsey, how are you holding up?" Malik unfolded himself from the mattress and approached the door. "I'm fine, Officer Barnes, just catching up on my meditation." She glanced nervously down the corridor before speaking again, her voice low. "Lieutenant Harlan is reviewing your case. I've recommended your return to general population." "Thank you," Malik said, studying her. "May I ask why?" Barnes hesitated. The incident report doesn't match what I witnessed. You made no explicit threat. Kincaid seems to think differently. Kincaid isn't thinking clearly where you're concerned. She paused. Something's got him rattled, ever since you mentioned that date, 2001. Malik said nothing, letting the silence draw her out. What did you find in those archives, Ramsey? She finally asked. The truth about Marcus Jackson, he answered simply. And Kincaid's role in his death. Barnes closed her eyes briefly. I thought it might be something like that. When she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her gaze. You should know. Harlan's terminated your library access. Officially, it's because of this incident. Unofficially, they're closing ranks. Malik finished for her. She nodded. Be careful, Ramsey. Kincaid has friends, both inside and outside. These walls. The slot slid shut, leaving Malik alone again with his thoughts. 4 more days passed before the cell door finally opened. Lieutenant Harlan stood there, face impassive, flanked by 2 guards Malik didn't recognize. Your segregation time has been reduced, Harlan announced without preamble. Good behavior and administrative review. Malik knew this was unusual. Early release from segregation rarely happened at Coldwater, particularly for insubordination. Thank you, Lieutenant, he said, rising from his mattress. Harlan studied him coldly. This is a one-time consideration, Ramsey. I suggest you avoid further confrontations with the staff. As the guards escorted him back to D Block, Malik caught fragments of their conversation. Something about Kincaid being on leave, about tensions in the yard. The prison grapevine had been working in his absence. When they reached his cell, the first person Malik saw was Deshawn, watching intently from across the block. The younger man's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in silent question. Later, in the yard, Deshawn managed to make his way to Malik's side. They let you out early, he said, keeping his voice down. Never seen that happen before. Officer Barnes advocated for me, Malik explained. It's more than that, Deshawn insisted. Something's different. Kincaid hasn't been around for 3 days. Rumor is he's on personal leave. Malik absorbed this information carefully. What else have you heard? Guards are acting jumpy. That new female officer, Barnes? I've seen her talking with Lieutenant Harlan a lot. Looks serious. Deshawn leaned closer. And there's something else. Some of the older inmates are talking about a death that happened years back. Black inmate named Jackson. Stories spreading. So the ripples had already begun. Malik hadn't expected things to move this quickly. Where are these stories coming from? He asked. Deshawn shrugged. Can't say for sure. But after they took you to the hole, people started asking questions. Word gets around. Across the yard, Reverend Miles stood watching them, his expression grave. When their eyes met, the chaplain gave a subtle shake of his head, a warning to be cautious. What did you say to Kincaid? Deshawn asked. What made him snap like that? Malik turned to face the younger man directly. I reminded him that history doesn't stay buried. And that got you thrown in the hole? It wasn't what I said, Malik explained quietly. It was what he heard. As they walked the perimeter of the yard, Malik felt a strange sense of clarity. The deposition hidden in his mattress was more than just evidence of past wrongdoing. It was a key that had unlocked something larger. By merely hinting at its existence, he'd set forces in motion that even Kincaid's rage couldn't contain. Officer. Barnes watched from her post by the fence, her posture tense but her eyes following Malik with something like respect. When he nodded in her direction, she returned the gesture, a small acknowledgement that allegiances were shifting. That night, as Malik lay on his bunk, he felt the weight of the copied deposition beneath him. For 5 years, he'd endured Kincaid's daily humiliations, presenting the calm exterior that had earned him the nickname, the one they couldn't break. But now, for the first time, he wasn't just enduring, he was advancing. The document wasn't just a weapon to be brandished in a moment of confrontation. It was a scalpel that, properly wielded, could peel back layers of corruption that had festered for years. But using it effectively would require more than personal courage. It would require allies, strategy, timing. As sleep finally came, Malik's last conscious thought was of Marcus Jackson, a man he'd never met but whose story now provided the leverage he'd been waiting for. The dead man's truth had become his tool for the living. In the darkness of D-Block, something was changing. Power was shifting, invisible but palpable, like the slow movement of tectonic plates before an earthquake. The laundry room at Coldwater hummed with industrial machinery, the air thick with steam, and the harsh smell of institutional detergent. It was one of the few places where inmates could speak without being constantly monitored. The noise of the massive dryers created pockets of relative privacy. Malik fed sheets into a folding machine, his movements practiced and efficient. Beside him, Deshawn worked with the nervous energy of youth, his eyes constantly darting toward the guard stationed by the door. "You need to calm down," Malik said, quietly. "Your body language screams guilty." "Easy for you to say," Deshawn muttered. "You didn't just get your cell tossed 3 times in a week?" Malik kept his voice low but steady. "Kincaid's trying to rattle you, trying to find something to connect us." It had been 10 days since Malik's return from segregation, 10 days of subtle shifts in Coldwater's ecosystem. Kincaid had returned from his unexplained absence more agitated than before, his usual calculated cruelty now edged with something frantic, and he'd turned his attention to anyone associated with Malik, especially Deshawn. "Man went through everything," Deshawn continued, anger tightening his voice. "Dumped my letters from my mama on the floor, stepped on my pictures, called it a routine inspection." "It won't be the last," Malik said. "He's looking for the deposition." Deshawn's hands stilled on the sheet he was folding. "You still got it?" "Parts of it. I moved it from my mattress. Too obvious." Malik glanced at the guard, who was momentarily distracted by a question from another inmate. Seizing the opportunity, he slipped a folded piece of paper from inside his uniform shirt and pressed it into Deshawn's palm. "Read it, memorize it, then flush it." Deshawn's fingers closed around the paper, sliding it into his pocket in one smooth motion. "What's the plan? We show this to someone who can do something, a lawyer or something?" "Not yet," Malik explained. "Right now, our advantage is that they don't know exactly what we have or who knows about it. We need to keep it that way while spreading the essential truth." "Which is?" "That Marcus Jackson didn't kill himself. That guards led by Kincaid beat him and covered it up. That the administration buried the evidence." Malik's voice remained calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that Deshawn had never seen before. "We don't need the document to tell that story." A shadow fell across their folding table. Officer Barnes stood there, clipboard in hand, her face professionally neutral. "Ramsey, Carter, you're both needed in Block C for cleaning detail after lunch." Malik nodded, recognizing the fabricated assignment for what it was, an opportunity to talk away from Kincaid's surveillance. Block C was undergoing renovations, portions of it emptied for repainting and repairs. Barnes led them to a section of empty cells, handed them mops and buckets, then positioned herself at the corridor junction where she could watch for approaching staff. "Make it look good," she said, nodding at the cleaning supplies. "We don't have much time." Malik dipped his mop in the bucket and began working on the floor, indicating that Deshawn should do the same. "Harlan's been briefed," Barnes said without preamble, her voice just above a whisper. "Something about potential disruption stemming from D-Block. Kincaid's pushing for lockdown procedures." "On what grounds?" Malik asked, continuing to mop. "Contraband concerns. Rumored uprising. Whatever justification sticks." She glanced nervously down the corridor. "He specifically mentioned you two, by name as persons of interest." Deshawn's knuckles whitened around his mop handle. "That's bullshit. We haven't done anything." "It's not about what you've done," Barnes explained. "It's about what Kincaid thinks you know." She turned to Malik. "Whatever you found in those archives has him scared. Real scared. Scared people are dangerous, Malik observed, his rhythm with the mop never faltering. Barnes nodded. Especially when they have power. Kincaid's been with Harlan in closed-door meetings all morning. I overheard fragments, something about containment and example setting. They're planning to isolate us, Malik concluded. Segregation again, probably. Cut off communication. That's my guess, Barnes agreed. I can't interfere directly. Not again. They're already watching me. Deshawn looked between them, his young face hardening with anger. So what? We just wait for them to come at us? Let them lock us up? Malik shook his head. No. We accelerate our timeline. He turned to Barnes. How much time do we have? She considered. Harlan's scheduled for external meetings this afternoon. Nothing will happen before tomorrow morning. Then we move tonight, Malik decided. The distant sound of a door opening echoed down the corridor. Barnes straightened immediately. Someone's coming. Keep working, she ordered, raising her voice to normal volume. I want these cells spotless before lunch. As footsteps approached, Deshawn whispered urgently to Malik, What's the plan? Not here, Malik murmured back. Basketball court. 4 o'clock. Lieutenant Harlan stood at the window of Warden Strickland's office, watching inmates cross the BUA yard for afternoon recreation. Kincaid's concerns seem excessive, Strickland said from behind his desk, reviewing the security briefing. What evidence do we have of an actual disruption? Nothing concrete, Harlan admitted. But there's been an uptick in whispered conversations that stop when guards approach, groups forming and dispersing in unusual patterns, and Ramsey's name keeps surfacing. Because Kincaid has a fixation on the man, Strickland replied dismissively. Has been for years. It's more than that. Harlan turned from the window. Since Ramsey's stint in the library archives and that incident during count, the dynamics have shifted. Inmates are watching the guards differently, particularly in D Block. Strickland leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You think Ramsey found something in those files? It wasn't a question, and both men knew what files they were really discussing. I think we should consider the possibility, Harlan said carefully. The Jackson case was never properly contained. Too many loose ends. That was 10 years ago, Strickland said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Coldwater has a long memory, especially for its dead. Harlan's tone was flat, pragmatic. If Ramsey has evidence, or even credible details about Jackson's death, it could cause significant disruption, particularly given the racial component. Strickland swiveled in his chair to face the window, his back to Harlan. What's your recommendation? Separate Ramsey and Carter. Move them to different blocks, restrict their yard time, monitor all interactions. Harlan paused. And I'd suggest temporarily reassigning Kincaid to administrative duties, away from direct inmate contact. Strickland turned back sharply. You think Ray is the problem? I think his emotional investment is becoming a liability, Harlan said diplomatically. His confrontation with Ramsey was public, witnessed by the entire block. It revealed vulnerability. Ray's family has served at Coldwater for 3 generations, Strickland said, his tone hardening. His father helped build this place into what it is. With respect, sir, that's precisely the issue. The Kincaid legacy at Coldwater includes certain historical practices that wouldn't withstand modern scrutiny. The warden stood, moving to a cabinet where he kept his bourbon. We don't reassign Kincaid. We contain Ramsey. He poured himself a drink without offering one to Harlan. Prepare the paperwork for an administrative transfer. I want Ramsey out of Coldwater by the end of the week. And Carter? Segregation, 30 days for suspected contraband. Harlan nodded, his face expressionless. I'll make the arrangements. After the lieutenant left, Strickland sipped his bourbon slowly, staring at the photographs on his wall. Images of Coldwater's groundbreaking ceremony in 1952, of himself shaking hands with state officials, of the prison's expansion under his leadership. Decades of carefully managed order, threatened now by whispers of a death most had forgotten. The basketball court was Coldwater's most public space, a concrete slab surrounded by fencing, visible from multiple guard towers. It was also, paradoxically, one of the best places for private conversation. The constant movement, the shouting, the distraction of the game itself provided cover. Malik and Deshaun occupied half the court with 4 other inmates, passing the ball in a casual pickup game. Between plays, words were exchanged in brief bursts, never while standing still. "They'll come for us tomorrow," Malik said as he passed the ball to Deshaun. "You'll be sent to segregation. I'm being transferred out completely." Deshaun missed his shot, frustration evident in his face. "How do you know?" Barnes overheard. "Harlan's call to admin," Malik explained, retrieving the ball. "They're processing the paperwork now." "So that's it? They win?" Deshaun's voice rose dangerously. "Keep it down," Malik warned, making a show of demonstrating proper shooting form. "And no, they don't win. We execute our plan tonight." As they continued playing, Malik outlined his strategy. The paper he'd given Deshaun contained the most damning portions of the deposition, the eyewitness account of Jackson being escorted to the shower by Kincaid, the description of injuries inconsistent with hanging, the cover-up of log entries. "You'll make 3 copies," Malik instructed. "During dinner, you'll pass one to Lewis in the kitchen crew. He works A block tomorrow. Second copy goes to Terrell at the far table. He has trustee access to administrative. Third stays with you." "What about you?" Deshaun asked, driving toward the basket. "I have the original and my own plan for it." Malik blocked his shot, using the moment of contact to add, "The key is not to expose everything at once, just enough pieces to let the story spread naturally." Deshaun nodded, understanding dawning on his face. "So when they lock us down, it'll be too late. The information will already be circulating." From the guard platform overlooking the yard, Ray Kincaid watched their game through narrowed eyes. Even at a distance, his tension was visible in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he tracked Malik's every movement. "He's watching us right now," Deshaun muttered, retrieving the ball. "Good," Malik replied. "Let him watch." In the officer's locker room after shift change, Kincaid slammed his locker shut with enough force to startle the other guards changing nearby. His face was flushed, a vein pulsing at his temple. "Problem, Ray?" Officer Peterson asked cautiously. "Administration," Kincaid spat. "Bureaucrats who've never had to control a cell block making decisions about security protocols." Peterson exchanged glances with another officer. Everyone knew about Kincaid's growing fixation on Ramsey and his protégé Carter. "Heard they're finally moving Ramsey out," Peterson offered, trying to be helpful. "That's something, right?" "Too little, too late," Kincaid growled. "Should have happened the minute he started digging through those basement archives." He yanked his jacket from a hook. Barnes never should have had him assigned there. She knew what she was doing. "Come on, Ray," Peterson said uneasily. "Barnes is just a rookie trying to make the education program work. She couldn't have known." "Couldn't she?" Kincaid interrupted, his voice rising. "Convenient how she's always around when Ramsey's involved. How she got him out of segregation early. How she assigns him and Carter to cleaning details together." The locker room had gone quiet, other officers pretending to be occupied with their lockers while listening intently. "You think Barnes is helping them?" Peterson asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "I think this place is changing," Kincaid said bitterly. "Used to be we all understood what it took to maintain order. My father wouldn't recognize Coldwater now." He slammed out of the locker room, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. "Ray's losing it," someone muttered once he was gone. Peterson sighed. "He's old school, doesn't know how to adapt." "Old school's one thing," another officer replied, "but he's seeing conspiracies everywhere now. Ramsey's got him rattled." As the conversation continued, Officer Barnes stood frozen by her own locker, having heard everything. Kincaid's paranoia was accelerating faster than she'd anticipated, and now she was in his sights too. Dinner at Coldwater was a carefully choreographed process. Inmates filed in by block, collected their trays, ate under supervision, and departed in the same orderly fashion. Conversations were permitted but closely monitored. Deshawn sat with his usual group, the folded papers Malik had given him burning a hole in his waistband. He'd made the copies using a contraband pen and paper stolen from the education room, working in the brief privacy of a bathroom stall. Across the cafeteria, Malik ate methodically, his eyes occasionally meeting Deshawn's in silent communication. The plan was simple but required precise timing. When Lewis passed by with the cleaning cart, Deshawn dropped his napkin and bent to retrieve it, using the moment to slip the first copy into Lewis's pocket. 20 minutes later, as Terrell stopped at their table to speak with another inmate, the second copy changed hands beneath the cover of overlapping food trays. Neither exchange took more than a second, but Deshawn's heart hammered in his chest each time. One mistake, one guard looking in the right direction at the right moment, and everything would unravel. As D Block's dinner period ended, inmates began filing toward the exit. Deshawn rose with his group, tray in hand, when a voice cut through the cafeteria noise. "Carter, hold up!" Kincaid stood by the door, eyes fixed on Deshawn with predatory focus. The young inmate froze, acutely aware of the third copy still hidden in his waistband. "Random search," Kincaid announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "Put down the tray and assume the position." Deshawn hesitated, panic rising in his throat. Across the room, Malik had paused, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. "You hear me, Carter?" Kincaid's voice hardened. "Up against the wall. Now." The cafeteria had gone silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Deshawn felt a familiar anger ignite in his chest, the same rage that had put him in Coldwater in the first place. His hands clenched at his sides. One quick move and he could be on Kincaid before anyone could stop him. The guard's taunting face, the smirk that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing, it all coalesced into a red haze of fury. Then, through the anger, Deshawn heard Malik's voice in his memory. "That's what they want. Your rage gives them power." With tremendous effort, Deshawn unclenched his fists. "Yes, Sergeant," he said, setting down his tray and moving to the wall. Kincaid approached slowly, clearly disappointed by the compliance. "Hands against the wall, feet back, you know the drill." As Kincaid began the search, his hands moving with deliberate roughness, Deshawn fixed his eyes on Malik across the room. The older man gave him an almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of approval, of solidarity. Kincaid's search grew increasingly aggressive as he found nothing. He patted Deshawn down twice, checked every pocket, even removed the young inmate's shoes. "Nothing today, Carter?" he asked, voice thick with suspicion. "Usually got something to hide, don't you?" Deshawn said nothing, focusing on controlling his breathing, on the techniques Malik had taught him for maintaining composure under pressure. The third copy of the deposition remained undetected, sewn into the waistband of Deshawn's uniform, a hiding method he'd learned from an old-timer during his first year inside. Frustrated, Kincaid finally stepped back. "You're clear, for now." As Deshawn moved to rejoin the exit line, Kincaid called after him. "Tell your mentor his transfer papers came through. He'll be leaving us soon," breaking up the little reading group. The words were meant to provoke, to elicit the reaction Kincaid had been denied during the search. But Deshawn kept walking, his face carefully neutral despite the surge of concern Kincaid's words triggered. Later, in the brief minutes before lockdown, Deshawn managed to catch Malik in the corridor between blocks. "Kincaid searched me after dinner," he reported quickly. "But the papers got through. Lewis and Terrell have their copies." "Good," Malik said. "And Kincaid mentioned my transfer?" Deshawn nodded grimly. "Said the papers came through. That means we have less time than I thought." Malik glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed. "There's been a change of plan. Tonight, after second count, you pass the third copy directly to Reverend Miles." "The chaplain? Can we trust him?" "He knew Jackson," Malik explained. "And he has one thing we don't: access to the outside." The warning buzzer for lockdown echoed through the corridors. Guards began directing inmates toward their cells. "What about you?" Deshawn asked urgently. "If they transfer you, I've hidden the original deposition where they won't find it," Malik assured him, "and I've been preparing for this possibility." As they were forced to separate, Malik added one final instruction. "Remember, the document isn't the weapon, the truth is. We don't have to show it to use it." Deshawn nodded, understanding the strategy now. They weren't just passing papers. They were lighting fires of knowledge that would continue burning long after they were separated. That night, as Coldwater settled into its uneasy darkness, the seeds of disruption had already been planted. "Into a block," Lewis whispered to his cellmate about a murder covered up as suicide, about a guard named Kincaid and a dead man named Jackson. In administration, a trustee named Terrell slipped a folded paper into a file destined for legal review. And in his small chapel office, Reverend Miles read the copy Deshawn had passed him during evening services, his aging face grave in the dim light. The document wasn't just circulating, it was metastasizing, the story growing and spreading with each telling. By morning, inmates in 3 different blocks would be discussing Marcus Jackson's death, connecting it to current grievances, seeing Kincaid's recent behavior in a new light. In his cell, Malik lay awake, listening to the familiar night sounds of the prison. For 5 years he'd endured Coldwater's systematic humiliation, had absorbed its punishments without breaking. Now, on the eve of his transfer, he'd transformed from victim to catalyst. The deposition had become more than evidence. It was a spark igniting long-suppressed fire in the blood of Coldwater's forgotten men. Tomorrow they might separate him from Deshawn, might remove him from Coldwater entirely, but it was already too late to contain what he'd set in motion. 3 cells down, Deshawn also lay awake, his anger now tempered with something new: purpose. Under Malik's guidance, he'd chosen discipline over rage, strategy over reaction. For the first time since his incarceration, he wasn't just surviving, he was resisting. And across the prison, in the officers' quarters, Ray Kincaid paced his small room, haunted by ghosts he'd thought long buried. The name Marcus Jackson, unspoken for a decade, now seemed to echo from every corner of Coldwater. His father had taught him that power required enforcement, that order was maintained through fear. But no one had prepared him for this. An enemy, who fought not with fists or shanks but with truth. The night deepened, and throughout Coldwater a current of whispers flowed from cell to cell, block to block, the beginning of a flood that would soon overflow its carefully constructed channels, washing away the foundations of lies on which the prison had been built. Morning count at Coldwater had always been a ritual of power, guards asserting control, inmates demonstrating submission. But this morning, something had changed. As Officer Peterson moved down A block with his clipboard, inmates stood at their cell doors as required. Yet there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Eyes that normally stayed downcast now tracked his movements with unsettling focus. Conversations that typically ceased at his approach continued in hushed tones, only to resume once he passed. "What's with everybody today?" he muttered to his partner as they completed the count. The answer came unexpectedly from an inmate named Simmons, a lifer who rarely spoke. "Officer Peterson," Simmons called, his voice carrying down the block. "That true about what happened to Marcus Jackson back in '01? Peterson froze mid-step. "What did you say?" "Marcus Jackson," Simmons repeated louder now. "Heard he didn't hang himself. Heard guards beat him to death in the shower." The cell block went silent, every inmate watching, waiting for the response. Peterson's face flushed. "That's enough, Simmons. Back in your cell." "Just asking a question, sir," Simmons replied, not moving. "Lot of guys wondering about it." From further down the block, another voice called out, "Yeah, we heard Sergeant Kincaid was there when it happened." Peterson's hand moved instinctively to his radio. "Control, this is Peterson. I need backup in A block." As reinforcements arrived and Simmons was escorted to segregation for inciting disruption, the damage was already done. The questions had been asked publicly, the allegations spoken aloud. What had been whispers was now open discourse. Lieutenant Harlan stood at the window of the security office, watching the yard through narrowed eyes. Below, inmates gathered, in small clusters despite the guards' efforts to disperse them, their body language tense and expectant. 3 incidents this morning, he reported to Warden Strickland, who sat reviewing incident reports. A block during count, kitchen during breakfast prep, and now this unusual gathering pattern in the yard. Strickland didn't look up from the papers. All referencing Jackson? Yes, and all mentioning Kincaid specifically. Harlan turned from the window. It's not random, sir. This is coordinated. By Ramsey. Almost certainly, though we've found no direct evidence linking him to the circulation of these stories. Harlan's voice reflected professional frustration. His transfer paperwork is ready. We can move him tomorrow. Tomorrow may be too late, Strickland said, finally looking up. This is spreading faster than anticipated. There's something else, Harlan added, his tone carefully neutral. Officer Barnes has requested transfer to administrative duties effective immediately. Strickland's eyes narrowed. Did she give a reason? Personal safety concerns. Bullshit, Strickland snapped, unusually profane. She's involved somehow, bring her in for questioning. Sir, without concrete evidence. This isn't a courtroom, Travis. This is prison administration. Strickland rose from his desk, his patience clearly fraying. We have a coordinated disruption threatening the order of this facility. I want to know who's involved, how deep it goes, and I want it contained. Today. The prison showers were one of Coldwater's most dangerous spaces. Tiled rooms with limited visibility and minimal supervision. Deshawn stood under the lukewarm spray, hyper-aware of his vulnerability, of the eyes watching him from the guard station. Since passing Malik's documents, he'd felt a target growing on his back. Kincaid had made a point of following him, of creating isolation around him. Now, as the shower room gradually emptied of other inmates, that sense of danger crystallized into certainty. The guard called final warning for shower time. Deshawn rinsed quickly, reaching for his towel when he heard the door open behind him. 3 inmates entered. None from his usual block, all considerably larger than him, all wearing the same predatory expression. Carter, one of them said, a heavy-set white inmate with prison tattoos crawling up his neck. Heard you've been spreading stories. Deshawn backed against the wall, eyes darting to the guard station. Empty. Convenient timing. Don't know what you're talking about, he replied, calculating distances to the exit, to potential weapons, to any means of defense. Kincaid sends his regards, another inmate said, moving to block the door. Says you need a reminder about respect. They converged on him in practiced coordination. Deshawn managed to land one solid punch before they had him pinned, one arm wrenched behind his back, face pressed against the wet tile. Nothing personal, the first inmate grunted in his ear. Just business. The beating was methodical, focused on his torso and legs, avoiding his face and any areas that would show obvious trauma. Professional work, the kind that spoke of instruction, of purpose beyond mere violence. Through the pain, Deshawn held on to one thought, one lesson Malik had impressed upon him. They want you broken, not just beaten. Don't give them that. When they finally released him, he slid to the shower floor, ribs screaming in pain, breath coming in shallow gasps. His attackers left as silently as they'd arrived. Mission accomplished. Minutes later, the guard returned, feigning shock at finding Deshawn injured. Medical emergency in the showers, he called into his radio, voice carrying just the right note of concerned professionalism. Inmate on inmate assault, perpetrators unknown. As the medical team arrived, Deshawn caught sight of Kincaid watching from the corridor, a cold smile of satisfaction on his face. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment Deshawn made a decision. Not revenge, Malik had taught him better than that, but resistance of a different kind. Who did this to you? The nurse asked as they helped him onto a stretcher. Despite the pain, Deshawn managed to speak clearly enough for those nearby to hear. Ask Sergeant Kincaid. Ask him about Marcus Jackson too while you're at it. Officer Lydia Barnes sat rigidly in the chair across from Lieutenant Harlan's desk. her hands folded in her lap to hide their slight tremor. The room felt too small, too warm, the silence stretching uncomfortably as Harlan reviewed the file before him. 3 months at Coldwater, he finally said, looking up. Exemplary performance reviews until recently. Now suddenly you're requesting administrative transfer? Barnes met his gaze steadily. As I stated in my request, sir, I have concerns about the current environment. Be specific. She chose her words carefully. There are tensions between certain officers and inmates that I believe are becoming volatile. You mean Kincaid and Ramsey? Barnes didn't flinch. Among others. Harlan leaned forward. Officer Barnes, let me be direct. Your name has come up repeatedly in connection with recent disruptions. You recommended Ramsey for library duty where he accessed sensitive archives. You intervened during his segregation stint. You've been observed having private conversations with him and Carter. I've followed all protocols, Barnes replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her racing heart. Any conversations with inmates have been within the scope of my duties. Harlan's expression hardened. Then perhaps you can explain this. He slid a paper across the desk, a photocopy of the deposition excerpt, the same one now circulating through Coldwater. Recognize it? Barnes glanced at the document without touching it. It appears to be an official deposition. Found in A block this morning, Harlan continued. A deposition from the archives you gave Ramsey access to. I never provided access to specific documents, Barnes countered. I was instructed to have him organize materials as part of the education initiative. Yet somehow he found this particular document, copied it, and now it's spreading through my prison. Harlan's voice remained calm, but his eyes had gone cold. Either you're complicit, Officer Barnes, or you're incompetent. Neither option looks good for your future in corrections. Barnes sat silent for a moment, weighing her next words carefully. Lieutenant, have you read the deposition? The question clearly caught Harlan off guard. That's not relevant to... It details the beating death of an inmate, Barnes pressed on. A death covered up as suicide. If it's authentic, shouldn't that concern us more than how inmates learned about it? Your job isn't to question historical incident reports, Harlan snapped. Your job is to maintain order and follow chain of command. Is that what we're doing now? Maintaining order? Barnes surprised herself with her boldness. Deshaun Carter is in the infirmary with 3 broken ribs after a random attack that occurred, while the shower guard was conveniently absent. Inmates are being sent to segregation for asking questions. That feels less like order and more like fear. Harlan's face darkened. You're treading dangerous ground, Barnes. I suggest you reconsider your position and your loyalties very carefully. He slid a form across the desk. Your transfer request is denied. You'll continue your regular duties while we investigate your involvement in these disruptions. Sign, here. Barnes took the pen but hesitated, something resolving within her. And if I refuse? Then you can clear out your locker today, Harlan replied coldly. And good luck finding another position in corrections with an insubordination discharge on your record. After a long moment, Barnes signed the form. Will that be all, Lieutenant? Harlan studied her, sensing the shift in her demeanor, but unable to pinpoint its nature. For now. But understand this. You're being watched. Every interaction, every conversation, every moment of your shift. One misstep, and you're done. As Barnes left the office, her fear had hardened into something else. Determination. The small notebook hidden in her locker, where she'd begun documenting incidents of abuse, would get new entries tonight. Dates, times, witnesses, specifics. If Coldwater wanted to threaten her, fine. But threats worked both ways. The administrative segregation unit was kept intentionally bland. White walls, fluorescent lights, silence enforced as policy. Malik sat across from Warden Strickland at the small metal table, hands resting calmly before him, eyes steady and observant. I'll be direct, Ramsey, Strickland began without preamble. You've been instigating disruption throughout my facility. I've been in my cell following regulations, Malik replied evenly. Don't play semantics with me, Strickland snapped. Somehow you've managed to circulate misinformation about a case from 10 years ago. Marcus Jackson, Malik said, watching Strickland's face closely. Hardly misinformation if you're aware of which case I'm supposedly discussing. The warden's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Jackson suicide was fully investigated and closed. That's a matter of record. Interesting that you call it a suicide, Malik noted, when I don't believe I mentioned how he died. The subtle chess match of their conversation hung in the air between them. Your transfer has been approved, Strickland said after a moment, changing tactics. Tomorrow morning you'll be moved to Ridgeland. Medium security, better conditions, farther from family visits, but I suspect that's not your primary concern. Is this meant to be punitive or protective? Malik asked, genuinely curious. Take it however you want. The point is you're leaving Coldwater. And Deshaun Carter? Carter will serve 30 days in segregation for his part in disrupting facility operations, Strickland replied coldly. Maybe more, depending on his behavior. Malik nodded thoughtfully. And Officer Kincaid? Will there be an investigation into his attack on Carter? Strickland's eyebrows rose slightly. There was no attack. Carter was involved in an altercation with other inmates, unless you have evidence suggesting otherwise. The kind of evidence that might be in a deposition? Malik asked pointedly. Or perhaps in medical records, guard shift logs, surveillance, footage? A flash of uncertainty crossed Strickland's face, quickly masked. You're reaching, Ramsey. Grasping at conspiracy theories won't change your situation. Perhaps not, Malik agreed. But I wonder, Warden, have you considered why this particular story has found such fertile ground? Why inmates across every block are suddenly asking about a death from 10 years ago? Because troublemakers like you and Carter. Because Coldwater has a credibility problem, Malik interrupted, his voice calm but insistent. When an inmate like Jackson dies under suspicious circumstances and it's brushed away, when someone like Kincaid is allowed to abuse his authority year after year, when beatings are orchestrated as random altercations, the ground becomes prepared for truth to take root. Strickland studied him with something like grudging respect. You really believe you're fighting some righteous battle here, don't you? The educated man against the corrupt system. I'm just trying to survive, Warden, Malik replied simply. But survival takes different forms. Sometimes it's keeping your head down. Sometimes it's standing up. Well, your stand ends tomorrow, Strickland said, rising to indicate the meeting was over. Pack your belongings tonight. Transport leaves at 0700. As guards led Malik back to his cell, Strickland remained seated, troubled by the conversation. Ramsey hadn't seemed concerned about the transfer, had almost seemed to expect it. That suggested planning, perhaps even a contingency for this very outcome. The warden reached for his phone, suddenly suspicious of their timetable. Harlan, move up Ramsey's transfer. I want him out of Coldwater tonight. The prison chapel was filled beyond capacity that evening. Reverend Miles had announced a special prayer service for healing and reconciliation within the Coldwater community, and inmates from every block had crowded in, drawn by the rare opportunity for cross-block gathering. Guards stood nervously at the perimeter, watching the unusual assembly with hands resting on their batons. Lieutenant Harlan observed from the back, cataloging faces, noting the unprecedented attendance. Malik sat in the front row, his presence a silent challenge to administration, proof that despite their efforts he remained a center of gravity within Coldwater's population. In the infirmary, Deshaun listened through a small radio the chaplain had brought him, connected to the chapel's modest PA system. Reverend Miles stood before the assembled men, his aged face solemn in the muted light. Brothers, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. We gather tonight in troubled times. There is tension in our community, questions being asked, truths being sought. His eyes moved across the congregation, acknowledging each section, each block. The book tells us that the truth shall set us free. But truth is a difficult road, especially in a place designed to restrict freedom. Throughout the room, inmates nodded, murmured agreement. The guards shifted uncomfortably. Tonight, we have a speaker who has asked to share words of reflection, Miles continued. A man who has walked Coldwater's halls with dignity despite great provocation. Malik Ramsey. A murmur rippled through the assembly as Malik rose and moved to the podium. Harlan straightened, suddenly alert, while the guards exchanged uncertain glances. This hadn't been part of the approved service plan. Thank you, Reverend, Malik began, his educator's voice filling the chapel without strain. I'll be brief. As I understand, time is limited. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Men, of all ages, races, backgrounds, united now in attentive silence. Tomorrow I'll be leaving Coldwater, he announced. Transferred to another facility. Before I go, I wanted to share something I've learned during my time here. The room was utterly still, every man present sensing the significance of the moment. Systems of oppression rely on isolation, Malik continued. They separate us from each other, convince us that our suffering is individual rather than collective. They use shame as a weapon, humiliation as control. His eyes found Harlan at the back of the room, acknowledgement rather than challenge. But systems have weaknesses. Chief among them is their dependence on silence, on the unspoken agreement that certain things will not be said, certain questions will not be asked. Throughout the chapel, men leaned forward slightly, absorbing his words. In recent days, many of you have heard about Marcus Jackson, Malik said, his voice dropping slightly so that everyone had to strain to hear, creating a sense of intimate conversation despite the crowd. You've heard that his death in 2001 may not have been as reported. You've heard names connected to that death, names that continue to carry authority in these walls. Harlan started forward, but hesitated, aware that interrupting now would only validate Malik's message. I cannot tell you what to believe, Malik continued. But I can tell you this. Asking questions is not a crime. Seeking truth is not disruption. And most importantly, you are not alone in that search. He stepped back from the podium, his brief message delivered. Reverend Miles returned, smoothly, transitioning to a prayer for guidance and protection. But the impact of Malik's words hung in the air, impossible to dispel. As the service concluded, inmates filtered out in regulated groups, returning to their blocks. Yet something had changed. A current of connection flowing between men normally kept separate. A sense of shared purpose where before there had been only shared confinement. At the door, Harlan intercepted Malik. That was quite a performance. Just a farewell message, Lieutenant, Malik replied calmly. Nothing inflammatory. You're walking a dangerous line, Ramsey. I believe I mentioned that very danger in my message, Malik said with the faintest hint of a smile. The risk of asking questions, of seeking truth. Harlan's radio crackled, with a message from control. He listened, then gave Malik a cold look. Your transfer has been moved up. Pack your things. You're leaving in an hour. Warden Strickland paced the length of his office, the emergency staff meeting he'd called already running 20 minutes over schedule. Around the conference table, department heads and senior officers watched his agitation with varying degrees of concern. I want a complete lockdown of all non-essential areas, he ordered. Yard time suspended for the next 48 hours. Meals delivered to cells. No group activities of any kind. Sir, the head of prison operations ventured cautiously. That's an extreme measure. We have no actual violence or concrete threats to justify. We have a facility on the verge of disruption. Strickland cut him off. Unusual gathering patterns, coordinated questioning of authority, targeted discussion of past incidents. I don't need to wait for a riot to take preventive measures. The classification as a riot prevention measure requires documentation of specific threats. The operations chief persisted. State oversight will demand justification. Strickland slammed his hand on the table. Then find me the justification. Search every cell in D block if you have to. I want contraband, I want evidence of coordination, I want something concrete I can point to. The room fell silent at his outburst. Strickland took a deep breath, regaining his composure. Ramsey's transfer is happening tonight, he continued more calmly. Once he's gone, we can begin dismantling whatever network he's established. Carter remains in medical isolation until he can be moved to segregation. I want every inmate identified, as part of the situation, separated and contained. As the meeting continued, outlining the lockdown procedures and investigative priorities, Officer Barnes sat silently at the far end of the table, recording each instruction, each rationalization, in her official capacity as meeting secretary. Beneath the table, her hand slipped occasionally to her pocket, where a small digital recorder captured everything. Insurance for whatever might come next. The transfer van waited in Coldwater's Sally Port, engine idling in the cool night air. 2 transport officers checked their paperwork as Malik, hands and feet shackled, was escorted from the building by a stone-faced Lieutenant Harlan. Ramsey, Malik A., one officer read from his clipboard. Transferred to Ridgeland Correctional Administrative Order. Harlan nodded curtly. That's him. All personal effects have been searched and are in the bag. As the transport officers took custody, Malik turned to Harlan. Lieutenant, a question before I go. Harlan looked at him warily. Make it quick. When you first came to Coldwater, before you learned how things worked here, what did you believe about corrections? Malik asked, his voice genuinely curious. Did you think it was about punishment or rehabilitation? For a moment, something flickered across Harlan's face, a shadow of the younger man he'd once been, perhaps, before Coldwater had shaped him. That's ancient history, he replied finally. Safe travels, Ramsey. As Malik was secured in the transport van, he caught sight of a familiar figure standing at a distant window, Reverend Miles, hand raised in silent farewell. Behind him, less distinct but unmistakable, stood Officer Barnes, her presence a final confirmation that the work they'd begun would continue. The van pulled away, carrying Malik through the massive gates of Coldwater and into the Mississippi night. But something of him remained behind, in the papers still circulating through the blocks, in the questions now being asked openly, in the subtle shift of power that had begun with a single document found in a forgotten archive. Inside, the facility, as lockdown procedures commenced and guards conducted aggressive searches of targeted cells, inmates exchanged knowing glances. Malik was gone, but his strategy remained. Truth as contagion, knowledge as resistance, unity as strength. In the infirmary, Deshawn lay awake, the pain in his ribs a constant reminder of the cost of challenging Coldwater's order. Yet despite the beating, despite Malik's transfer, he felt something unfamiliar rising within him. Not the hot rage that had defined his early years inside, but a cooler, more focused resolve. The echo chamber had cracked. The carefully maintained silence around Marcus Jackson, around Kincaid's abuses, around Coldwater's entire system of control through fear and isolation, all of it had been pierced. And through those cracks, voices were beginning to rise, questions multiplying, connections forming across lines previously uncrossable. As midnight approached and Coldwater settled into its enforced silence, Warden Strickland stood at his office window, bourbon in hand, watching the distant taillights of the transfer van disappear around a bend in the road. He'd won this round, removed the primary agitator, reasserted control. Yet victory felt hollow, provisional. Ramsey was gone, but the seeds he'd planted remained, taking root in soil made fertile by years of abuse and cover-ups. The warden drained, his glass unable to shake the uncomfortable feeling that he hadn't ended a disruption. He'd merely witnessed its beginning. The transfer to Ridgeland lasted exactly 72 hours. On the 4th morning, without explanation, Malik found himself being processed back into Coldwater. No one would tell him why the sudden reversal, but the grim efficiency of the guards suggested administrative urgency rather than routine procedure. Looks like somebody wants you back real bad, the processing officer remarked, clearly puzzled. Never seen a transfer reverse this quick. As Malik was escorted through familiar, corridors, he noticed the atmosphere had shifted dramatically during his brief absence. Guards moved in pairs, tense and watchful. Inmates walked with heads lowered but eyes alert, exchanging glances loaded with unspoken communication. The air hummed with suppressed energy. Coldwater was a facility holding its breath. "Lieutenant," Harlan waited in the administrative conference room, his posture military rigid, face a careful blank. "Surprised to be back?" he asked once they were alone. "Surprised you'd want me back," Malik replied. Harlan placed a folder on the table between them. "Your transfer created more problems than it solved. We've had 3 separate incidents since you left. Work stoppages, mess hall protests, even guards calling in sick at unprecedented rates. And you think my return will calm things down? I think it's time we address the source of the disruption directly." Harlan tapped the folder. "This contains every document related to Marcus Jackson's death, the official report, the medical examiner's findings, the administrative review." Malik eyed the folder without touching it. "Does it contain the deposition from Officer Rodriguez?" A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed Harlan's face. "Yes. The complete, unredacted version." "Why show me this now?" "Because Warden Strickland is away at a regional conference. Because we have 48 hours before this situation explodes beyond containment. And because I believe you have additional documentation we haven't yet discovered." Malik sat back, studying the lieutenant. "What makes you think that?" "The specificity of the rumors. Details about Jackson's injuries that weren't in the deposition. Witness statements we've never located. Someone's feeding information into the population. Coordinated, strategic information." It was Malik's turn to tap the folder. "Maybe your official files aren't as complete as you think." "Or maybe," Harlan countered, "you made copies of more than just the Rodriguez deposition during your time in the archives." The standoff between them stretched into silence, each man calculating his next move. "What are you proposing, Lieutenant?" Malik finally asked. "An exchange. You provide whatever additional documentation you've secured. In return, I ensure a formal review of Jackson's case conducted by external investigators." "And Kincaid?" "Reassigned pending review." Malik shook his head. "Not good enough. Kincaid faces official investigation for Jackson's death and for orchestrating Carter's beating. Barnes is protected from retaliation. Carter is released from segregation immediately." "You're not in a position to make demands," Harlan said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Aren't I?" Malik smiled thinly. 3 incidents in 3 days without me even being here. Imagine what happens when word spreads that you brought me back only to continue the cover-up." Harlan's jaw tightened. "You'd risk a full-scale riot. People could die, Ramsey." "I don't want violence," Malik said quietly. "I never have. But truth suppressed becomes something dangerous, something uncontrollable. The choice isn't between peace and disruption anymore. It's between controlled exposure and chaotic revelation." The lieutenant stood, pacing the small room. "You realize Strickland will fight this every step of the way. His career is built on Coldwater's reputation. Then perhaps his career is built on lies." After a long moment, Harlan nodded. "I'll take your terms to Acting Warden Jeffries. You'll remain in administrative segregation until we reach an agreement." As guards escorted Malik to the segregation unit, he caught glimpses of familiar faces watching from cells and workstations. Deshawn, in the medical unit, his eyes widening in surprise. Reverend Miles in the corridor, a subtle nod of acknowledgement. And most significantly, Officer Barnes at her post, her carefully neutral expression betrayed by a flash of relief. The game had entered its final phase. Officer Barnes slipped the handwritten note under Acting Warden Jeffries' door after midnight. A risk, but a calculated one. The facility's reduced night staff and security camera blind spots, long ignored due to budget constraints, now served her purpose. By morning, the administration was in carefully concealed chaos. Barnes, assigned to clerical duty in the front office, overheard fragments of urgent calls. State officials consulted, legal advisors summoned, contingency plans discussed, in hushed tones. Shortly after noon, she was summoned to Jeffrey's office, where Harlan waited with a grim expression. "Officer Barnes," Jeffries began without preamble, "Lieutenant Harlan informs me you've been involved in the Jackson investigation." "I've followed procedure in all my duties," she replied carefully. "This isn't about procedure," Jeffries said, sliding a document across the desk. "This is about testimony. We need a statement from you regarding Sergeant Kincaid's actions toward inmate Carter and any other incidents you've witnessed." Barnes stared at the form, an official misconduct investigation document, not the sham internal review she'd expected. "This is a formal investigation?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "As of this morning," Harlan confirmed. "External oversight from the State Department of Corrections." She took the form, still suspicious. "And I have protection from retaliation?" "In writing," Jeffries assured her, indicating a second document. "Your cooperation is essential, Officer Barnes. This situation has escalated beyond Coldwater's walls." As Barnes began her statement, documenting months of observed abuses and procedural violations, a weight lifted from her shoulders. The risk she'd taken, using her late father's journalism contacts to ensure copies of key documents reached both state officials and select media outlets, had created the external pressure needed to force the administration's hand. The laundry room was nearly empty that afternoon, most inmates restricted to their cells as part of the continued lockdown. Malik, granted special permission to collect his belongings from storage, sorted through a bin of personal items under the watchful eye of a young guard named Peterson. "Officer," Peterson's radio crackled. "Report to Block D for count support." Peterson hesitated, protocols warring with practicality. "I have a segregation inmate unsecured." "Direct order from Lieutenant Harlan," the voice insisted. "All available. Officers to Block D immediately." 5 minutes, Peterson told Malik reluctantly. "Don't move from this spot." The moment the door closed, Malik sensed he wasn't alone. From between massive dryer units, Ray Kincaid emerged, his uniform disheveled, eyes feverish with barely contained rage. "Thought you were so smart," he said, voice unnaturally calm despite his appearance. "Turning my own people against me, making deals with Harlan." Malik stood perfectly still, noting the makeshift knife in Kincaid's hand, a sharpened fragment of metal gleaming dully in the fluorescent light. "It's over, Sergeant," Malik said quietly. "The investigation is happening, whether I'm alive or not." "You think I don't know that?" Kincaid advanced slowly. "My career's already dead. My father's legacy, my family's name, all ruined because you couldn't leave the past buried. Marcus Jackson deserved justice." "Jackson was nothing," Kincaid snarled, his composure cracking. "Just another troublemaker who needed discipline. My father taught me how to handle his kind, how to maintain order." "Your father taught you to torture and murder inmates?" Malik asked, his voice deliberately even. "To cover up deaths? To perpetuate a system built on fear and racism?" Kincaid lunged suddenly, pressing Malik against the wall, blade against his throat. "My father was a good man. He dedicated his life to this place, to keeping animals like you in line." Despite the cold metal against his skin, Malik met Kincaid's gaze steadily. "Your father was part of a broken system, Ray. And you had a choice, to perpetuate that brokenness or to be better." "Shut up," Kincaid pressed harder, drawing a thin line of blood. "You don't get to judge me. You don't get to destroy everything I've built." "You destroyed it yourself," Malik replied softly. "Every time you chose cruelty over justice, every time you followed your father's path instead of finding your own." Something fractured in Kincaid's eyes, rage giving way to a more fundamental anguish. "You think you've won. This changes nothing. Coldwater will always be what it is." "It already has changed," Malik said. "Look around you. Listen. Feel it. The silence is breaking." The laundry room door burst open. Officer Barnes stood there, weapon drawn, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Drop the weapon, Sergeant. Now." Kincaid spun, knife still pressed to Malik's throat. "Back off, Barnes, this isn't your problem." "It became my problem when you decided to assault an inmate under investigation protection." Barnes took careful aim. "Last warning, drop the weapon." For a terrible moment, the outcome hung in balance. Kincaid's desperation against Barnes's resolve. Then, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, Kincaid's shoulders slumped. "Thikao." Knife clattered to the floor. "You're throwing away your career," he told Barnes bitterly as she cuffed him. "For what? For him?" "For the oath I took," she replied. "The one you forgot." That evening, as news of Kincaid's arrest spread through Coldwater's population, the atmosphere shifted from tense anticipation to cautious victory. Inmates gathered, in small groups during the first relaxed dinner period in days, sharing updates, comparing versions of events. In the administrative wing, Acting Warden Jeffries signed the paperwork placing Kincaid on administrative leave pending criminal investigation. Lieutenant Harlan, watching from across the desk, felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at addressing a festering wound in Coldwater's operation, concern about the implications for the facility's future, and reluctant respect for the man who had orchestrated it all. "Ramsey played this perfectly," he admitted. "Used our own systems against us." "He exposed corruption," Jeffries corrected. "That's not playing anything. That's doing what we should have done years ago." Harlan nodded thoughtfully. "What happens? Now?" "Now?" Jeffries sighed heavily. "Now we clean house. State investigators arrive tomorrow. Media already has parts of the story. We can control the narrative or be controlled by it." In the chapel office, Malik sat with Reverend Miles and Officer Barnes, the three unlikely allies united by the risks they'd taken. "The Jackson family deserves to know the truth," Miles said, handling the folder of evidence they'd assembled. "All these years, thinking their son took his own life." "They'll know," Barnes assured him. "I've arranged for copies to reach their attorney through my father's old colleague at the Jackson Clarion-Ledger." Malik remained quiet, contemplative despite their victory. "This is just one case, one facility." "But it's a start," Barnes insisted. "And sometimes that's all you need, one crack to let the light in." As night fell over Coldwater, the facility settled into an unfamiliar calm. Not the enforced silence of oppression, but the quieter peace of a long-delayed reckoning. In cells throughout the blocks, inmates slept with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring change, that voices long silenced were finally being heard. For Malik, lying on his bunk in administrative segregation, the victory was bittersweet. The system that had wrongfully convicted him remained intact, yet he had found a way to fight it from within, not with violence, but with truth. As a weapon, it had proven more powerful than any blade. The battle for Coldwater's soul had reached its turning point, but the war against institutional injustice continued. Tomorrow would bring investigators, questions, perhaps even cameras. The world outside, those walls would finally glimpse the reality inside. And Malik Ramsey, once a high school principal teaching young minds to question and seek truth, had delivered perhaps his most important lesson, that even in chains, knowledge remained the ultimate power. The headline in the Jackson Clarion-Ledger was damning. "Death behind bars. Coldwater. Correctional facility implicated in cover-up." Beneath it, a grainy photograph of Marcus Jackson from his high school graduation, smiling, full of promise, juxtaposed with the stark image of Coldwater's imposing facade. Warden Strickland's hands trembled slightly as he set the newspaper down on his desk. He'd cut his conference short, driven through the night to return to a facility suddenly under the state's microscope. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, the governor's office, the dock commissioner, even a state senator's aide. All with the same message: fix this, contain it, explain it. "How the hell did this happen?" he demanded of Harlan, who stood ramrod straight before the desk. "I'm gone for 3 days and you allow this catastrophe?" "The situation developed rapidly, sir," Harlan replied, his voice neutral. Acting Warden Jeffries made the determination that transparency was the most prudent approach. "Transparency?" Strickland nearly shouted. "We have reporters at our gates. I've been summoned to Jackson to explain to the governor why a decade-old Suicide is suddenly headline news. Harlan's expression didn't change. The investigation suggests it wasn't suicide, sir. Strickland stared at him, searching for the loyal lieutenant who had always understood the delicate balance between order and accountability. Instead, he found a man transformed, one who had glimpsed a different kind of order. "Where's Kincaid now?" Strickland asked, his voice lower, dangerous. "On administrative leave pending investigation. He surrendered his credentials yesterday after the incident with Ramsey." "And Ramsey? Tell me he's at least been transferred out as planned." Harlan shifted slightly. The transfer was rescinded. Given the circumstances and the media attention, Acting Warden Jeffries felt removing him might appear retaliatory. Strickland's fist came down hard on the desk. "I don't care how it appears. I want him gone. Today." "Sir," Harlan said carefully, "with respect, that decision is no longer entirely in our hands. The State Department of Corrections has assigned an oversight team. They've specifically requested that all key witnesses, including Ramsey, remain on site during the initial investigation." The warden sat heavily in his chair, the full weight of the situation settling on him. "And Jeffries approved all this? Without consulting me?" "He followed protocol for official misconduct allegations." "Get out," Strickland said quietly. "Send Jeffries in." As Harlan left, Strickland turned to the window overlooking the yard. Below, inmates moved in their regulated patterns, but even from here he could sense the difference. A new energy, a collective awareness. The facility that had been his life's work that he had shaped in his image was slipping from his control. Deshaun Carter stood at the fence line in the exercise yard, ribs still bandaged beneath his uniform, but healing enough to allow his return to general population. Around him, inmates gathered in unusual configurations, groups that would normally avoid each other now engaged in intense conversation. "They're saying Kincaid might face criminal charges," an older inmate was telling the group. "Actual prison time." "I'll believe it when I see it," another replied skeptically. "Man's got connections. His daddy was tight with half the state board." "This is different," Deshaun insisted. "There's evidence, documents, witnesses coming. Forward." "Because of your boy Ramsey," a voice said from behind. Deshaun turned to find Lewis, the kitchen worker who had helped distribute the first copies of the deposition. "Man played it smart, used their own system against them." Deshaun nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Teach always said knowledge was the weapon they couldn't take from us." Across the yard, a different conversation was taking place, one with darker undertones. A cluster of younger inmates huddled near the basketball court, their body language aggressive, energized. "We got them on the ropes now," one was saying. "This is the time to push harder, show them we ain't backing down." "What you suggesting?" another asked. "When they call dinner, nobody goes. We stay right here, make them come drag us in." Deshaun noticed the exchange and moved closer, concern etching his features. "That's not the way," he interrupted. "Ramsey didn't set all this in motion just so we could throw it away on a yard standoff." The younger inmate scoffed. "No disrespect to your mentor, Carter, but maybe his way is too slow. We got momentum now." "And what happens when they bring in the tactical team?" Deshaun challenged. "When they hit you with batons and pepper spray, you think that helps anyone?" The group fell silent, the reality of their vulnerability momentarily dampening their revolutionary fervor. "Ramsey's way is working," Deshaun continued, his voice gaining confidence with each word. "The system's cracking from inside. Don't give them an excuse to patch it up with force." As the yard debate continued, guards watched nervously from their posts. The facility remained technically on lockdown, but administration had authorized limited yard time, partly as pressure release, partly to maintain the appearance of normal operations for the investigators now on site. Officer Barnes, reassigned to yard duty despite her pivotal role in recent events, observed the interactions with careful neutrality. Only when her gaze met Deshaun's did her expression soften slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of their shared purpose. Her radio crackled with an unexpected announcement. "All officers be advised. Sergeant Kincaid has entered the facility. He is not authorized for duty. If spotted, report to control immediately. Barnes straightened, scanning the perimeter with renewed vigilance. The official story was that Kincaid had surrendered his credentials, but rumors suggested otherwise, that he'd refused to hand over his ID card, that he still had supporters among the guard force, that his family connections made him untouchable despite the allegations. Near the chapel entrance, Reverend Miles emerged, his aging figure somehow more commanding than usual. As if drawn by an unseen force, inmates began drifting toward him, the yard's fractious energy temporarily redirected. "Brothers," he called, voice carrying across the concrete expanse. "Join me in prayer. For peace. For justice. For wisdom in uncertain times." One by one, inmates gathered around him, forming a circle that grew until it encompassed nearly half the yard's population. Even those who normally avoided the chaplain's services joined, sensing the significance of the moment. Miles looked across the gathered men, his eyes eventually finding Deshawn. "Brother Carter, would you lead us?" Surprised but honored, Deshawn stepped into the center of the circle. As he bowed his head to begin, the yard fell into a silence so complete that the distant sound of the perimeter fence creaking in the wind was clearly audible. From the administrative building, Malik watched the scene unfold, permitted a brief time outside his segregation cell for a meeting with state investigators. The sight of Deshawn leading the prayer circle, of the unified gathering of inmates, transcending their usual divisions, filled him with quiet pride. "Your protege has found his voice," Officer Barnes observed, standing beside him at the window. "He always had it," Malik replied. "He just needed to discover its power." Their moment of reflection was interrupted by hurried footsteps in the corridor. Lieutenant Harlan appeared, his normally composed demeanor visibly strained. "Kincaid's in the building," he informed them tersely. "Security cameras caught him, entering through the service gate. He still has his access card." "How is that possible?" Barnes asked. "Wasn't his access revoked?" "Should have been. Someone failed to process the security update." Harlan's eyes met Malik's. "He's heading for the yard." The prayer circle had just dispersed when the yard gate opened with a metallic clang. Inmates turned as one to see Ray Kincaid stride through, still wearing his uniform despite his suspension, face set in a mask of defiance. A murmur rippled through the yard. Guards exchanged uncertain glances, radios squawking with confused commands from control. Kincaid moved with purpose toward the center of the yard, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the palpable tension that followed his path. He stopped at the exact spot where, for years, he had conducted counts and inspections, where his authority had been absolute and unquestioned. "Count time," he announced, his voice carrying the same commanding tone it always had, though now it held a brittle edge. "Form up by blocks." No one moved. Inmates stood frozen, watching him with expressions ranging from disbelief to barely contained fury. From his post, the yard supervisor keyed his radio. "Control, we have an unauthorized officer attempting to initiate count. Request immediate assistance." Kincaid's gaze swept the yard, finding Deshawn among the crowd. "Carter, you heard me. Count formation now." Deshawn remained motionless, his young face suddenly older, waited with the decision before him. The yard door opened again. Malik stepped through, flanked by Lieutenant Harlan and Officer Barnes. The sight of him, calm, dignified, unbroken, sent another wave of whispers through the assembled inmates. "Sergeant Kincaid," Harlan called, his voice official, controlled. "You are not authorized to be on prison grounds. I need you to surrender your ID and leave the facility immediately." Kincaid ignored him, eyes locked on Malik. There he is, the man who thinks he can change Coldwater. His laugh was sharp, almost manic. "You don't change this place, Ramsey, it changes you." "Stand down, Ray," Harlan ordered more firmly this time. "Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" Kincaid's voice rose. "You want to see worse? How about when these animals realize there's no one left willing to do what's necessary? When they see weakness and exploit it?" The yard had gone completely silent, The confrontation now, the center of a collective focus so intense it seemed to vibrate in the air. Guards at the perimeter had drawn batons, uncertain which threat to address, the unauthorized officer or the inmates watching with increasingly hostile expressions. Malik stepped forward, separating himself from Harlan and Barnes. "This isn't about control anymore, Kincaid. It's about accountability." "Easy for you to say," Kincaid sneered. "You've never had to maintain order in a place like this, never had to make the hard choices." "Beating a man to death isn't a hard choice," Malik replied, his voice carrying across the yard without rising. "It's a failure of humanity." Kincaid's hand moved to his belt, where his baton would normally hang, finding it empty. His fingers clenched into a fist instead. "You think you've won? This is bigger than one case, one guard. This is a war that was raging before you got here, and will continue long after you're gone." "Maybe so," Malik acknowledged. "But today, in this yard, it stops." For a moment the two men stood facing each other, embodiments of opposing forces that had clashed within Coldwater's walls for generations. Around them, inmates and guards alike seemed to hold their breath, sensing the historical weight of the confrontation. The stillness was broken by the yard's main gate opening. Warden Strickland entered, accompanied by two state police officers. "Raymond Kincaid," one officer announced formally. "You're in violation of the terms of your administrative leave. We need you to come with us, sir." Kincaid didn't move, his eyes still fixed on Malik. "One last time, teacher," he said, his voice suddenly quiet. "Count formation, show them who really runs this yard." The challenge hung in the air between them, a final attempt to reassert the old order, to prove that despite everything, the fundamental power dynamic remained unchanged. Malik glanced around the yard, at the faces watching, waiting for his response. Deshawn, Reverend Miles. The countless men whose names he might never know but whose silent support had sustained him through years of daily humiliation. Then he looked back at Kincaid, a man clinging desperately to an identity, a system, a worldview that was crumbling around him. "No," Malik said simply. The word, soft yet firm, reverberated through the yard like a thunderclap. As the state officers moved to take Kincaid into custody, the facility's lights flickered briefly, a common occurrence during Mississippi summer heat. But in that moment, it felt symbolic. The old power faltering, if only for an instant, while something, new and undefined, waited to take its place. Warden Strickland watched the scene unfold with the stunned expression of a man witnessing the end of an era. His facility, his legacy, had fundamentally changed in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. In the fading afternoon light, as Kincaid was escorted from the yard in handcuffs, inmates and guards alike seemed suspended between past and future, the familiar brutal certainties of Coldwater giving way to the uncertain promise of what might follow. And at the center of it all stood Malik Ramsey, no longer just a man fighting for his dignity, but a symbol of resistance that had transcended its origins. The battle that had begun with a document found in a dusty archive had culminated here, not with violence or chaos, but with a simple, powerful refusal. The final count was coming, but it would not be on Kincaid's terms. Dawn at Coldwater broke with unusual clarity, the summer haze temporarily lifted by an overnight thunderstorm. The facility grounds glistened, rain-washed and somehow renewed, as the first rays of sunlight struck the guard towers. Inside D Block, Malik stood at his cell door for morning count, aware that this might be his last day within these walls. The state investigation team had established temporary offices in the administrative wing, their presence signaling an unprecedented intervention. Dozens of inmates had already been interviewed, their testimonies forming a damning portrait of Coldwater's operation under Strickland and Kincaid. As the block door opened, a collective tension rippled through the cells. Instead of the expected count team, Ray Kincaid entered alone, still wearing his uniform despite his suspension. His face was haggard, eyes bloodshot, but his posture retained its military rigidity. Behind him, two regular guards followed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to challenge him directly. One whispered urgently into his radio, reporting the unauthorized presence. "Count formation," Kincaid barked, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent block. "Everyone out, center line." Inmates exchanged uncertain glances, caught between habitual compliance and the new awareness that had spread through Coldwater. Some moved hesitantly to their doors while others remained still, watching, waiting. The cell doors slid open automatically. Someone in control had authorized the count. Despite the irregularity, as inmates filed into the center aisle, Kincaid walked the line with exaggerated precision, his boots striking the concrete with familiar authority. He stopped before Malik's cell. "Out, Ramsey. Center of the block." Malik stepped out, hands at his sides in the regulation position. Around him, other inmates watched with growing tension, sensing the dangerous energy emanating from Kincaid. "Perfect timing," Kincaid announced, his voice pitched to carry down the entire block. "I hear the transfer papers finally came through. You're leaving us today, teacher. One last count before you go." From the block entrance, Lieutenant Harlan appeared, moving with controlled urgency. "Sergeant Kincaid, you are not authorized for duty. Stand down immediately." Kincaid ignored him, focus fixed entirely on Malik. "But first, I think we need to remember our morning ritual. The pledge, Ramsey. One more time for old time's sake." The block fell into complete silence. Every man present understood the significance of the moment. This wasn't just about a transfer or a suspension or even an investigation. This was Kincaid's last stand, a desperate attempt to reassert the psychological dominance that had defined his career. "No," Malik said quietly. The word hung in the air, simple, yet revolutionary. "What did you say?" Kincaid's voice dropped, dangerously. "I said no." Malik's voice remained calm, dignified. "There will be no more pledges, no more humiliation. It ends here." Kincaid's face contorted with rage. "On your knees, Ramsey, now." "Sergeant Kincaid," Harlan shouted, moving forward. "This is your final warning." The two regular guards exchanged alarmed glances, hands moving uncertainly toward their batons. Throughout the block, inmates tensed, the atmosphere electric with possibility. "Last chance, Ramsey," Kincaid hissed, stepping closer until they were inches apart. "Kneel and recite the pledge, or I promise you'll never make it to that transfer." Malik looked directly into Kincaid's eyes, seeing beyond the rage to the fear beneath it, the terror of a man watching his world collapse. "I will not kneel," he said softly, for Kincaid alone. "Not today. Not ever again." Kincaid's hand went to his belt, drawing a concealed baton that extended with a metallic snap. Guards shouted warnings. Inmates surged forward instinctively. And then something extraordinary happened. Deshaun Carter, 3 cells down, stepped into the center aisle and knelt, not in submission to Kincaid, but directly facing Malik. His eyes locked on his mentor, his posture deliberate and dignified. One by one, other inmates followed, dropping to their knees in the center aisle, faces turned toward Malik. Not cowering, not surrendering, but offering something entirely different: solidarity. From the block entrance, Officer Barnes stepped forward, unclipping her radio and setting it aside. With deliberate slowness, she too knelt, her uniform creating a startling contrast to the sea of inmate jumpsuits. The wave continued, spreading through D block like a silent tide. 2 inmates, then 5, then 20, then the entire block. Even the second guard, a young officer who had joined Coldwater just months earlier, set down his baton and knelt. Kincaid stood frozen, his weapon half raised, as the symbolic power he had wielded for years evaporated before his eyes. Around him, the kneeling men created a living testament to the failure of his methods, to the bankruptcy of the system he represented. "This isn't happening," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Get up, all of you, on your feet. That's an order." No one moved. No one spoke. The collective silence was more powerful than any shout could have been. The block door opened again. Warden Strickland entered, flanked by state investigators and tactical officers. He stopped short at the scene before him, the entire block kneeling, Kincaid isolated at the center, Malik standing alone like an island in a human sea. "What the hell is this?" Strickland demanded, his authority already undermined by the tableau before him. "This is Coldwater finding its conscience," Harlan replied quietly. Strickland's face flushed dark red. "Clear this block. Get these men back in their cells immediately." The tactical officers moved forward uncertainly, but the kneeling inmates remained motionless, their silent protest more powerful than any resistance they could have offered. "You're too late, Carl," Kincaid said, his voice oddly distant. "It's already gone. Everything we built." Before anyone could stop him, he swung the baton, not at Malik, but at the nearest security camera, shattering it in a shower of plastic and sparks. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted, voice rising to a desperate pitch. "You think investigations and newspaper articles and kneeling inmates change what this place is?" Tactical officers rushed forward, restraining him as he continued to struggle. "My father walked these blocks. His father before him. We kept order, when no one else would do what was necessary." As they dragged him away, his final shouts echoed through the block. "You need men like me. You've always needed men like me." In his wake, the kneeling protest remained unbroken, the silence profound and purposeful. Strickland surveyed the scene, the reality of his situation becoming inescapably clear. His facility was no longer under his control, not physically perhaps, but certainly morally. "Return to your cells," he ordered, though his voice lacked conviction. "This disruption is over." No one moved. "You heard the warden," Harlan said, stepping forward. "Back to your cells, in an orderly fashion." Still, no one moved. It was Malik who finally broke the impasse. "It's all right," he said, his voice carrying across the silent block. "We've made our statement. Return to your cells with dignity." One by one, the inmates rose, first Deshawn, then others, each moving with deliberate calm back to their cells. Officer Barnes stood retrieving her radio, her face composed but her eyes shining with emotion. As order gradually reasserted itself, Strickland approached Malik, voice low and tense. "You've won this round, Ramsey, but don't think for a minute this is over." "It was never about winning," Malik replied. "It was about truth, about justice for Marcus Jackson and every man who suffered under Kincaid's brand of order." "Your transfer proceeds today," Strickland said coldly. "I want you out of my facility within the hour." Malik nodded, accepting this without protest. The victory had never been about his personal freedom. It had been about changing Coldwater itself, about exposing the rot at its foundation. The transfer van waited in the sally port, just as it had days earlier when Malik had briefly left Coldwater only to return. This time, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. As guards escorted him through the corridors, inmates and staff alike watched his passage with newfound respect. Some nodded subtly, others stood straighter as he passed, small gestures of acknowledgement that would have been unthinkable weeks before. In the administrative processing area, Deshawn waited with Reverend Miles, granted special permission to say goodbye. "This isn't right," Deshawn said as Malik approached in transport restraints. "After everything that's happened, they're still shipping you out." "It's better this way," Malik assured him. "Coldwater needs to heal, to transform. That's harder. With me here as a constant reminder." "What happens now?" Deshawn asked, his young face serious with new responsibility. "To all of us?" "You continue," Malik said simply. "Not with violence or disruption, but with dignity and truth. The state investigation is just beginning. Make sure Marcus Jackson's story is told completely." Reverend Miles stepped forward, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "The spirit remains even when the prophet departs," he said with quiet certainty. "What you started here can't be undone." Officer Barnes approached, clipboard in hand. "Transport's ready," she announced officially. Then, more softly, "I submitted my resignation this morning, and this." She showed him a copy of a thick document, her meticulous record of abuses witnessed during her time at Coldwater, time-stamped, Dated, named. Civil rights attorneys will receive the original by tomorrow. Malik nodded, understanding the sacrifice this represented for her. Will you be all right? I have an interview with the State Oversight Committee next week, she replied with a small smile. Turns out they're very interested in first-hand accounts from former Coldwater staff. As final processing was completed and Malik prepared to board the transport, he turned to Deshawn one last time. Remember what we talked about. Strategy over rage. Knowledge over force. I remember, Deshawn assured him, standing straighter than he had when they first met. A boy becoming a man under the harshest circumstances. We all do. The van doors closed, and Malik settled onto the hard transport seat, hands and ankles shackled as procedure required. Through the small window he caught a final glimpse of Coldwater's imposing structure, the place that had attempted to break him daily for 5 years, now irrevocably changed by truth's slow, inexorable power. As the van pulled away, he thought, not of Kincaid or Strickland or even his own uncertain future, but of Marcus Jackson, a man he'd never met, whose death had gone unmourned and unpunished for a decade. Today, at least, Jackson's story had been heard. His life had mattered. His truth had finally emerged from the shadows. The road stretched ahead, leading Malik to another facility, another chapter. But behind him, the ripples of what had begun at Coldwater continued to spread. State investigators interviewing inmates and staff, media outlets digging into decades of suspicious incidents, civil rights attorneys preparing cases on behalf of those who had suffered under the old regime. The system remained. The broader injustices that had wrongfully convicted Malik and countless others still stood. But something fundamental had shifted, a demonstration that even within the most oppressive environments, dignity could be maintained, truth could prevail, and power could be reclaimed through unexpected means. Malik Ramsey left Coldwater in Nabir, chains but not in defeat. The table had turned, and though the game was far from over, the rules had changed forever. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.